Hello, how are you today? And are you ready to hear mysteries? If you're ready, I'll tell you.
Factory. Alex had recently taken a job as a night shift security guard at an old factory on the outskirts of town. The factory, once a thriving hub of production, had been largely abandoned after a devastating fire years ago. The fire had claimed several lives, and since then, the place had gained a reputation for being haunted. Alex, a skeptic by nature, didn't believe in ghosts, but he needed the job. It was a cold, rainy night when Alex started his shift. The wind howled through the broken windows, and the rain tapped a steady rhythm on the roof. The factory was vast, with long, dark corridors and large, empty production floors. Alex's task was to patrol the grounds, ensuring no trespassers entered the building. As he made his rounds, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed to dance just out of reach of his flashlight, and every creak and groan of the old building made him jump. He told himself it was just the wind and his imagination playing tricks on him. Around midnight, Alex reached the section of the factory where the fire had been the most intense. The walls were blackened with soot, and the air still carried a faint smell of smoke. As he walked through the charred remains, he heard a faint sobbing sound. He stopped, straining to hear over the rain. "Hello, is anyone there?" he called out, but there was no response, just the echo of his own voice. He shook his head and continued his patrol, but the sobbing grew louder, more desperate. Alex followed the sound, his heart pounding. The sobbing led him to an old storage room. The door was slightly ajar, and a dim light flickered inside. Alex pushed the door open and shone his flashlight around the room. It was empty, except for old machinery and stacks of forgotten boxes. The sobbing had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and Alex could see his breath forming in front of him. He felt a chill run down his spine as he turned to leave. But before he could take a step, the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. Panic surged through him as he tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then he heard it a low, guttural whisper, like someone speaking directly into his ear. "Help me ... double quotes. The voice sent shivers down his spine. Alex spun around, his flashlight flickering wildly. In the corner of the room, he saw a figure materialize. It was a woman, her clothes singed and her face twisted in agony. Alex backed away, his mind racing. "Who are you?" he stammered. The woman's eyes locked onto his. "We can't leave ... we're trapped ... forever ... double quotes." Before Alex could react, the woman lunged at him, her face contorting into a mask of rage and despair. He stumbled backward, crashing into a stack of boxes. The impact knocked the flashlight from his hand, plunging the room into darkness. He fumbled for his radio, desperately calling for help. Static crackled through the speaker, followed by a distorted voice. "Alex thought ... get out ... now ... With renewed determination, Alex threw his weight against the door. It finally gave way, and he stumbled into the corridor. He didn't stop running until he reached the security office, slamming the door behind him. He grabbed the phone and called his supervisor, his hands shaking. His supervisor arrived a short while later, finding Alex pale and visibly shaken. "What happened?" the supervisor asked. Alex recounted his experience, his voice trembling. The supervisor listened intently, then sighed. "You're not the first to see her. After the fire, some of the workers' spirits never left. They say the woman you saw was one of the factory workers who died trying to save others. Her spirit roams the factory, reliving the tragedy." Alex was given the night off. As he drove home, the rain pounding on his windshield, he couldn't stop thinking about the woman and the horror etched on her face. The factory wasn't just a place of work, it was a place where the past lingered, where the souls of the lost cried out for release. From that night on, Alex approached his job with a newfound respect for the stories and the spirits that haunted the old factory. The night shift at the factory was no longer just a job, it was a journey into the unknown, a place where the living and the dead coexisted in a fragile balance, and where the echoes of the past could still be heard, calling out through the darkness. Amusement Park. Ethan had been working as a night shift security guard at an old amusement park for a few months. The park, once a bustling attraction filled with laughter and joy, had seen better days. It was now a shadow of its former self, with rusting rides, faded signs, and an air of abandonment that hung heavy over the grounds. Local legends whispered about the park being haunted, but Ethan had always dismissed such tales as just that stories. One foggy night, as Ethan began his rounds, he noticed the eerie stillness that enveloped the park. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, muffling the usual sounds of the night. As he made his way through the main thoroughfare, his flashlight cutting through the mist, he heard a distant melody. It was the faint sound of a calliope, a relic from the park's heyday, playing a haunting tune. Ethan followed the sound, which led him to the old carousel. The ride had been out of operation for years, its horses frozen in mid-gallop, their paint chipped and faded. But tonight, the carousel was moving, slowly turning as the eerie music played. Ethan's heart pounded as he approached the ride. He called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" There was no response, only the creaking of the carousel and the ghostly melody. As Ethan circled the ride, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, on one of the horses, sat a little girl in an old-fashioned dress. Her eyes were wide and vacant, staring straight ahead. Ethan's flashlight flickered, and when he looked again, the girl was gone. He quickly radioed his supervisor, but the response was static. Frustrated and scared, Ethan decided to continue his rounds, hoping to shake off the unsettling encounter. He made his way to the Ferris wheel, another relic of the park. As he neared, he saw the gondola swaying gently, despite the absence of wind. A sense of dread washed over him. Ethan climbed the steps to the control booth and peered inside. The booth was empty, but the control panel showed signs of recent use. Suddenly, the Ferris wheel began to move, the gondolas creaking as they ascended into the fog. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had to find out who or what was behind this. He ran to the House of Mirrors, thinking it might be a prankster hiding inside. The entrance was shrouded in darkness, and the mirrors inside reflected distorted images of Ethan as he stepped cautiously through the maze. As he turned a corner, he saw a figure standing still in the reflection. He spun around, but there was no one there. Ethan's breath came in short, panicked gasps. He pressed on, his flashlight beam dancing off the mirrors. Every now and then, he caught glimpses of movement figures darting out of sight, faces appearing and disappearing in the reflections. The air grew colder, and he felt a chill run down his spine. Finally, he reached the center of the maze, where a large mirror stood. In its reflection, Ethan saw himself, but there was something off. His reflection was smiling a twisted, malevolent grin. Ethan took a step back, and the reflection did the same, but the grin remained. Suddenly, the reflection reached out, its hand emerging from the glass. Ethan stumbled back, his flashlight falling from his grasp. The figure in the mirror began to crawl out, its body contorting unnaturally. Ethan turned and ran, the sound of shattering glass echoing behind him. He burst out of the House of Mirrors and sprinted towards the security office, not daring to look back. When he finally reached the office, he found his supervisor waiting, concern etched on his face. "What happened?" the supervisor asked. Ethan, out of breath and visibly shaken, recounted his experiences. The supervisor listened quietly, then nodded ... "You're not the first to see things in this park," the supervisor said. "Years ago, there was a tragic accident here. Several people died, and since then, strange things have been happening. Some say the spirits of those who died are still here, trapped in the park." Ethan was given the rest of the night off. As he drove home, his mind replayed the night's events. The haunting melody, the ghostly girl, the Ferris wheel, and the House of Mirrors, it all seemed like a nightmare, but the fear was real. From that night on, Ethan's perception of the amusement park changed. He still did his job, but with a heightened sense of awareness. The park held secrets, dark and terrifying, and Ethan knew he had only scratched the surface. The amusement park was no longer a place of fun and joy. It was a realm where the past lingered, and the spirits of the departed roamed freely, seeking solace or perhaps revenge. Hospital. Jake had worked as a night shift security guard at the hospital for over a decade. He was used to the eerie silence of the hospital corridors at night, the occasional flickering light, and the distant hum of medical machines. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened on that cold winter night. The hospital was an old building with a wing that had been closed off for years. This wing had a reputation for being haunted, but Jake had never paid much attention to the rumors. Until that night, it was around 2 a.m. when Jake received a call from the security office. There were reports of strange noises coming from the old wing. He grabbed his flashlight and reluctantly made his way to the deserted part of the hospital. The old wing was dark and musty, with the faint smell of antiseptic still lingering in the air. As Jake walked down the long corridor, he heard a soft, shuffling noise. He called out, "Is anyone there?" But there was no response. The sound seemed to come from the old operating theater at the end of the hall. Jake cautiously approached the door and pushed it open. The room was empty, but the air was thick with an unsettling presence. He shone his flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. Suddenly, he felt a cold breeze brush past him, sending chills down his spine. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, indistinct but definitely there. Jake's heart pounded as he turned toward the sound. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, stood a shadowy figure. It looked like a person, but its form was hazy, almost translucent. Jake's breath caught in his throat. "Who's there?" he demanded, but the figure remained silent. He took a step closer, and the figure seemed to move, gliding effortlessly across the floor. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. Without warning, the figure lunged toward him. Jake stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, and Jake felt an icy hand grip his arm. He struggled to break free, his mind racing with terror. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Jake was left standing alone in the dark, his heart pounding. He fumbled for his flashlight and quickly exited the room, his legs shaking. When he reached the main part of the hospital, Jake reported the incident to his supervisor. The supervisor, an older man with a stern expression, listened quietly and then nodded. "You're not the first to see something in that wing," he said. "Many years ago, there was a tragic accident during surgery. A young nurse died, and since then, people have reported seeing her ghost." Jake was given the rest of the night off. He drove home, his mind reeling from what he had experienced. He couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure or the cold grip on his arm. Despite his years on the job, Jake never went back to that old wing. The experience left him with a deep-seated fear of the unknown and a respect for the stories that had been whispered among the hospital staff for years. From that night on, Jake made sure to steer clear of the old wing. The hospital might have been his workplace, but he now knew that some places were best left undisturbed. The old wing held secrets, and Jake had no intention of uncovering any more of them. Night watch at the mall. Tom Walker stepped into the dimly lit security office of the sprawling department store, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. It was his first night on the job, and he was eager to prove himself. His colleagues, Mike and Steve, greeted him with friendly smiles. Both had been working there for over 2 years and knew the place inside out. "Welcome to the night shift, Tom," Mike said, clapping him on the shoulder. "It's pretty quiet around here, but we'll show you the ropes." Steve nodded in agreement. "Just stick with us, and you'll be fine. We've got rounds to make in different sections, so let's get started." Their first stop was the food section. The aisles were dark, the shelves casting long shadows that seemed to move with the flickering fluorescent lights. As they walked through, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Ever feel like this place is ... different at night? Tom asked, trying to sound casual. Mike chuckled. Every newbie says that. It's just your imagination. But as they turned a corner, Tom saw something that made his blood run cold, a figure standing at the end of the aisle. It was an old woman, her eyes wide and staring. Before Tom could react, she vanished. Did you see that? Tom whispered urgently. Steve sighed. Don't worry about it. Just shadows playing tricks on you. Next, they headed to the bookstore. The smell of old paper and leather filled the air, and the silence was almost oppressive. Tom felt a chill as they walked among the tall shelves. As they approached the children's section, a book fell off the shelf, landing with a thud at Tom's feet. He picked it up, an old, tattered copy of a fairy tale. When he opened it, he saw that the pages were blank. That's odd, he muttered. What's odd? Steve asked, looking over his shoulder. Tom showed him the book, but when Steve looked, the pages were filled with text. Just your imagination again, Tom, Steve said with a shrug. Tom wasn't convinced. As they moved on, he felt a cold breeze, though there were no open windows. The toy section was next. Brightly colored toys lined the shelves, their cheerful appearance at odds with the growing sense of dread Tom felt. As they walked through, the toys seemed to watch them with lifeless eyes. Tom heard a giggle and turned to see a doll sitting on a shelf, its head slowly turning to face him. He jumped back, colliding with Mike. Easy there, Tom, Mike said. This place can be creepy, but it's all in your head. Just then, a toy train started moving on its own, chugging along the floor. Tom's heart raced as it circled their feet before coming to a stop. That was not normal, Tom stammered. Steve laughed nervously. Yeah, sometimes the toys have a mind of their own. Let's keep moving. Their final stop was the women's clothing section. Mannequins stood in various poses, dressed in the latest fashions. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows, making the mannequins seem almost alive. As they walked through, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that the mannequins were watching them. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, sure that one had moved. Mike, Steve, do you ever get the feeling these mannequins are following us? Tom asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Steve shrugged. It's just the lighting. Come on, let's finish up. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging them into darkness. Tom fumbled for his flashlight, his hand shaking. When he finally turned it on, he saw that the mannequins had shifted positions, now standing in a circle around them. Mike, Steve, Tom shouted, but his voice echoed in the empty store. A cold breeze swept through the aisles, and Tom heard whispers, soft and unintelligible. The mannequins' blank faces seemed to twist and change in the dim light, their eyes following him. We need to get out of here, Tom said, his voice trembling. Mike nodded, his face pale. Let's go. They hurried back to the security office, the eerie feeling lingering behind them. Tom couldn't shake the sense that they were being followed. As they entered the office, the lights flickered back on. Steve looked at Tom, his expression serious. You handled that well, Tom. This place ... it has a history. We don't talk about it much, but you're not imagining things. We've all seen strange things here. Tom nodded, his fear slowly turning into a grim acceptance. So, what now? Now, we do our job and stay alert, Mike said. And remember, you're not alone. As the night wore on, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that the department store held more secrets than he could ever imagine. But with Mike and Steve by his side, he felt a bit more prepared to face whatever came next. The haunted aisles and ghostly figures would be a part of his nightly rounds, a constant reminder that some places never truly sleep. Shadows in the mall. Jacob Miller, a seasoned security guard with 2 years of experience, had just been transferred to a new location, a massive department store with a reputation for strange occurrences. Though he had heard whispers about the place, he dismissed them as rumors. His first night on the job, however, would prove that some stories are rooted in truth. Jacob met his new colleagues, Sam and Rachel, in the security office. Both had been working there for several years and seemed unfazed by the eerie atmosphere. "Welcome, Jacob," Sam said, giving him a firm handshake. "This place can be ... interesting at night. Just stick with us, and you'll be fine." Rachel nodded, her expression serious. "We'll be making rounds through various sections tonight. It's important to stay alert." Their first stop was the electronics section. The store was dark, save for the occasional flicker of neon lights from the displays. As they walked through the aisles filled with TVs, laptops, and gadgets, Jacob felt a chill in the air. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Do you ever get used to this?" Jacob asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sam chuckled. "You get used to ignoring it." Suddenly, a row of televisions flickered on simultaneously, displaying static before showing the same eerie, shadowy figure standing motionless. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. "Did you see that?" Jacob whispered urgently. Sam and Rachel exchanged a glance. "Just a glitch," Sam said, though his voice wavered slightly. "Let's keep moving." Next, they headed to the furniture section. The large, dimly lit space was filled with couches, beds, and dining sets, casting long, ominous shadows. As they walked through, Jacob felt a growing sense of unease. Suddenly, one of the reclining chairs started to rock back and forth on its own. Jacob froze, his flashlight trained on the chair. "That's not normal," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel looked at the chair, her face pale. "This place has a mind of its own. Just stay close." As they moved further, Jacob heard the sound of soft footsteps behind them. He turned quickly, but saw nothing. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Keep your focus, Jacob," Sam said. "It's just your mind playing tricks." Their next stop was the sports section. The area was filled with exercise equipment, sports gear, and bicycles. The silence was almost oppressive, amplifying every creak and rustle. As they walked through, Jacob noticed a punching bag swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. He approached it cautiously, reaching out to stop its movement. A sudden cold breeze swept through the aisle, and Jacob heard the faint sound of a ball bouncing. He turned to see a basketball slowly rolling towards him from the darkness. "Guys, this is getting weird," Jacob said, his voice trembling. Sam and Rachel nodded, both looking uneasy. "Let's finish up and head back," Sam suggested. Their final stop was the home appliances section. Washing machines, refrigerators, and microwaves lined the aisles. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows, making the large appliances seem almost alive. As they walked through, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the appliances were watching them. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, sure that something was moving in the shadows. "Sam, Rachel, do you ever get the feeling these things are following us?" Jacob asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Before they could answer, the lights went out, plunging them into darkness. Jacob fumbled for his flashlight, his hand shaking. When he finally turned it on, he saw that the appliances had shifted positions, now forming a path leading deeper into the section. "We need to get out of here," Jacob said, his voice trembling. Rachel nodded, her face pale. "Let's go." They hurried back to the security office, the eerie feeling lingering behind them. Jacob couldn't shake the sense that they were being followed. As they entered the office, the lights flickered back on. Rachel looked at Jacob, her expression serious. "You handled that well, Jacob. This place ... it has a history. We don't talk about it much, but you're not imagining things. We've all seen strange things here." Jacob nodded, his fear slowly turning into a grim acceptance. "So what now?" "Now, we do our job and stay alert," Sam said. "And remember, you're not alone. As the night wore on, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the department store held more secrets than he could ever imagine. But with Sam and Rachel by his side, he felt a bit more prepared to face whatever came next. The haunted aisles and ghostly figures would be a part of his nightly rounds, a constant reminder that some places never truly sleep. The Cemetery Watchman. Jorge had been a security guard at the San Miguel Cemetery in South America for 2 years. The cemetery, nestled on the outskirts of a small town, was known for its sprawling grounds and ancient tombstones. Despite the eerie surroundings, Jorge took pride in his work, ensuring that the final resting place of many was respected and undisturbed. From the beginning, Jorge felt a peculiar presence in the cemetery. His shifts often started in the late afternoon and ended at dawn, the hours when shadows grew longer and the silence became almost oppressive. His colleague, Carlos, had been there for 1 year less than Jorge and was more skeptical about the supernatural, often dismissing George's experiences as tricks of the mind. One night, as Jorge made his rounds near the older section of the cemetery, he heard faint whispering. At first, he thought it was the wind rustling through the trees, but the whispers grew louder and more distinct. He followed the sound to a mausoleum that hadn't been opened in decades. As he stood there, the air grew cold, and he saw a translucent figure of a woman in a flowing white dress, her eyes filled with sorrow. She seemed to be trying to say something, but her words were lost to the wind. George's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood his ground, determined to understand what she wanted. When Jorge shared this experience with Carlos, his friend laughed it off. "You're letting this place get to you," Carlos said. There's no such thing as ghosts. However, Jorge couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was trying to tell him something important. A few nights later, Jorge and Carlos were patrolling together when they heard the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter echoing through the graves. They followed the sound to a small, overgrown plot where a child's grave stood. There, they saw the spectral form of a young boy playing with a ghostly ball. Carlos, usually so composed, turned pale. "Do you see that?" He whispered to Jorge. Jorge nodded, a chill running down his spine. The boy looked up at them, smiled, and vanished into thin air. Carlos was shaken, but still skeptical. It could have been a trick of the light, he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Over the next few months, the encounters grew more frequent and unsettling. One night, while patrolling alone, Jorge saw a group of ghostly figures dressed in old-fashioned clothes gathered around a tombstone. They seemed to be holding a silent vigil, their faces etched with sadness. As Jorge approached, they slowly turned to look at him, their eyes filled with a deep, unspoken grief. He backed away, feeling their sorrow wash over him like a cold wave. Jorge and Carlos also started experiencing strange phenomena in their office. Objects would move on their own, and the lights would flicker without explanation. One night, Jorge found an old photograph on his desk, depicting the same woman he had seen in the mausoleum. She was standing with a man and a child, all smiling. The photograph was dated 1923. Jorge felt a connection to these spirits, as if they were reaching out to him for help. Determined to uncover the truth, Jorge began researching the history of the cemetery and the people buried there. He discovered that the woman in the photograph was Maria, who had lost her husband and son in a tragic accident. Overwhelmed by grief, she had taken her own life and was buried in the very mausoleum where Jorge first saw her. The child they had seen was Maria's son, who had died in the accident. With this knowledge, Jorge and Carlos decided to perform a small ritual to honor the spirits and help them find peace. They gathered near Maria's mausoleum, lit candles, and offered prayers. As they did, the air grew warmer, and they felt a sense of calm wash over the cemetery. That night, as Jorge and Carlos made their final rounds, they saw the figures of Maria and her family one last time. This time, they were smiling, and as the sun began to rise, they slowly faded away, leaving behind a feeling of tranquility. From that day on, the eerie encounter ceased. Jorge and Carlos continued their duties, now with a deeper respect for the cemetery and the stories of those who rested there. The San Miguel Cemetery was no longer just a place of sorrow, but a place of peace, where the living and the dead could coexist in harmony.
The Veterans Vigil.
Mark Davis had been a security guard for over 10 years. He had seen it all: shoplifters, vandals, and even a few attempted break-ins. But nothing prepared him for what he would encounter at his latest assignment of vast, aging shopping mall with a reputation for being haunted. On his first night, he was introduced to the teen, Paul, a friendly but quiet man in his late 30s, and Lisa, a sharp and seasoned guard who had been at the mall for nearly as long as he had been in the profession. They briefed him on the mall's layout and the routine rounds they needed to make. "You'll get used to it," Paul said with a half-hearted smile. "Just be prepared for some unusual occurrences." Mark's first rounds were uneventful. The mall, closed to the public, was eerily silent. As he walked through the darkened corridors, his footsteps echoed ominously. The mannequins in the display windows seemed to watch him, their blank eyes following his every move. In the home decor section, he felt a sudden chill. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and he heard a faint whisper. Turning quickly, he saw nothing but empty aisles and shelves. "Just the wind," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. A few nights later, Mark was assigned to check the old cinema on the 3rd floor. The cinema had been closed for years, its seats covered in dust and its screens silent. As he entered, the smell of mold and decay filled the air. Using his flashlight, Mark navigated through the rows of seats. Suddenly, he heard the faint sound of a film projector. His heart pounded as he followed the noise to the projection room. The door creaked open, revealing an ancient projector running on its own, displaying static on the screen. "Default text, how is this even possible?" Mark whispered, his hand trembling as he reached to turn off the machine. As soon as he did, the room plunged into silence, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. One particularly cold night, Mark was sent to inspect the basement storage area. It was a vast, labyrinthine space filled with old merchandise and forgotten decorations. The air was thick with dust, and the dim lighting cast long, eerie shadows. As he walked through the maze of boxes and shelves, he heard faint footsteps behind him. Spinning around, he saw nothing. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent. Mark quickened his pace, trying to find the source, but every turn led him deeper into the basement. Suddenly, he came face to face with an old, rusted mirror. In its cracked surface, he saw the reflection of a young girl standing behind him, her eyes hollow and sorrowful. He spun around, but the girl was gone. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "This isn't real," he told himself, but the encounter left him shaken. Mark's most chilling experience occurred on a stormy night. He was asked to check the rooftop for any damage. The wind howled as he climbed the stairs, and the rain lashed against the building. As he stepped onto the rooftop, lightning illuminated the sky, casting eerie shadows. He walked the perimeter, inspecting the edges and vents. Suddenly, he heard a voice calling his name, faint but distinct. "Mark ... Mark ... He turned, shining his flashlight into the darkness. There, standing at the edge of the roof, was a figure. It was a man, dressed in old security guard attire, looking out over the city. Mark approached cautiously. "Who are you?" Mark called out, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly turned to face him, revealing hollow, empty eyes. Mark stumbled back in horror, his flashlight flickering. The figure stepped closer, and Mark felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He turned and ran, not stopping until he was back inside the building, his heart pounding in his chest. The next day, Mark shared his experiences with Lisa and Paul. They exchanged knowing looks. "You're not the first to see him," Lisa said quietly. "They say he was a guard here years ago. Fell from the roof during a storm just like the one last night." Paul nodded. Some say his spirit never left. He's been watching over this place ever since. Mark listened, feeling a chill run down his spine. Despite his years of experience, he knew this mall was unlike any other place he had worked. The encounters had left him with a deep sense of unease, also a strange sense of duty. He was determined to uncover the truth behind the mall's haunting and ensure that the restless spirits found peace. As the nights passed, Mark remained vigilant, his senses heightened. He never saw the rooftop figure again, but the whispers and footsteps persisted, a constant reminder that some places are never truly empty. Mark's story spread among the security staff, becoming a part of the mall's eerie legend. His experiences served as a warning to new guards. The mall was not just a place of commerce, but a realm where the past and present intertwined, where the shadows held secrets and the night watch was never truly alone.
Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of darkness. If you enjoyed this tale, please like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more chilling stories of the unknown.